Hi everyone, Future Blaine here. I'm just dropping in a little before the episode proper to let you know that life happens. As a result, one of us had to record this episode while we were on the road. So we were using Skype's built-in recorder instead of having two clean audio files recorded locally on our computers. I removed as much of the background noise as I could. Removing much more would start to damage the quality of the voices themselves. So please bear with us. This is not going to be typical of the episodes going forward, but we have it here because this was the conversation. We thank you for your understanding. It was the dawn of the third age of podcasting, 30 years after the series had launched.
The Babylon podcast was a dream given form. Its goal, to discuss the place where humans and aliens could work out their differences peacefully.
It's a port of call, home away from home for established fans, newbies, Jon, Blaine, and guests.
Humans and aliens wrapped in 2,500,000 tons of spinning metal, all alone in the night.
It could be a dangerous place.
Wait, what?
But it's our last, best hope for peace.
This is the story of the last of the Babylon stations.
The year is 2024.
The name of the podcast is
Babylon 5, 30 years later.
Hello, and thank you for downloading this latest episode of Babylon 5, 30 years later. This is the podcast that is looking at every episode of the classic science fiction television series Babylon 5, with each episode releasing 30 years after the original air date. My name is John Wilson, and I have never seen Babylon 5 before, except for all the episodes I've seen before this, but everything after this I've never seen before. So this has been my first journey through this show, and I'm having a great time. And holding my hand through all of this, gently leading me through the woods and the trees and the rivers and the winding time-traveling events is my good friend and partner on this show, Blaine Dowler. Hello, Blaine. How are you?
I'm doing well. How about you, John?
I'm doing all right. And next to him is Blaine Dowler. Hello, Blaine. How are you?
A little frazzled, a bit scarred, but generally okay.
This episode is Babylon Squared. So we've got two Babylons, two Blaines, and I don't know, maybe two of a lot of things we're done with all of this. Babylon Squared. Wow, this is quite the episode. I guess I should give the details about it here. It was released on the 10th of August, 1994, which is why this episode is coming out on the 10th of August, 2024. It is the 20th episode of the season, so we are nearing the end. Written by J. Michael Straczynski. I think we've seen him on the show before, and directed by Jim Johnston. I know we've seen him on the show before. And yeah, anything you want to say about it before we get into the plot synopsis?
Yeah, not a huge amount that should go before the plots, but yeah, as you said, Jim Johnston, this is his 6th of 12 episodes that he's directing. And I haven't counted how many episodes this is written by J. Michael Straczynski, but as we've said before, he does 92 of 110 in the regular series, plus that pilot movie. So
I think the specific number is umpteenth.
Yeah, somewhere in there.
All right, so this is a pretty straightforward episode plot-wise. It is 90% A plot, with Delenn having a little side quest on the side. And basically what we have going on here is there is a charming scene where we're coming on to the beginning of day shift, and Lieutenant Commander Ivanova is just not a morning person. She is one of those do not talk to me until I've had my coffee kind of people. So she sits down to breakfast with Sinclair and Garibaldi, and she's kind of nodding off in front of them. And evidently, this is a frequent enough occurrence that they have decided to set up a practical joke. Sinclair starts talking to her very monotonously and droningly to help her fall asleep with her head propped up on her arm. And while she's asleep, they swap their full breakfast dishes for empty breakfast dishes that they had secreted off to the side. And once they have done that, they, loudly start up conversation again, which startles Ivanova awake. And they're talking about how they're about to go on shift because that was a great breakfast. And she's like, "Oh no, it's 7:30. I slept through breakfast." And she she runs off to the CNC because she's late for her duty shift. And they laugh, they have a good time, they go on eating, and then there's a charming moment where Garibaldi's like, "In 3, 2, 1," and you hear Ivanova scream from off stage that she's coming for Garibaldi, she's coming for him, and all that he stands for. Anyways, not as much detail on the rest of the synopsis. It was just a really, really charming scene, and we don't see a lot of Ivanova for the rest of the episode. We are detecting tachyon particles from Sector 14. And any sci-fi watcher, especially Star Trek watcher, knows that tachyon particles mean time travel. So they send out a Star Fury to check it out. The pilot encounters some sort of blast of energy, and when he returns to the station, he dies as his ship is approaching the station. They examine him. His body was apparently okay on first pass, but all of his internal organs have been aged considerably. There's been some sort of extra time passing on his body. So Sinclair does not know what's going on. He takes a volunteer group of exploring officers. He offers them the complete knowledge chance to back out of the mission. No one backs out. They go and they find Babylon 4 has appeared in the present day. It disappeared with no report on the day that it was supposed to go into operation 4 years earlier, and now here it is. So Sinclair and Garibaldi identify themselves to the officers in charge of the station. At first, they hesitate on mentioning that they're from Babylon 5 because they don't want to put anyone off. But they do get, make contact with the Babylon 4 officers. They go on board the station. First, there's nobody around. They run into this hysterical, upset man who is violent and just trying to get off the station. The other Babylon 4 officers appear and are able to help Sinclair and Garibaldi subdue the man. And turns out that what's happening is that people are unstuck in time when they're on this station. We saw like a force field that all the ships went through as they were approaching the station. So there's this three-dimensional area of space that is having temporal anomalies, as Star Trek would say. And we immediately see another one because Sinclair flashes to some scene of intense conflict where he and Garibaldi are immersed in some sort of fighting scene. We don't know if it's the past or the future, although we can assume it's probably the future. So anyways, they decide that Babylon 4 is here. We don't know exactly why it's unstuck in time. We don't know why it's here, but let's get everybody off because staying here is dangerous. They contact the station. They begin evacuation proceedings. Sinclair and Garibaldi and the officer in charge of the station, whose name is Krantz, I believe.
Yes, Major Krantz.
Major Krantz.
And he's not the commanding officer of the station, but he is in charge right now because his job was to oversee construction.
Okay, since they had just gone into operation. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so he's more like the foreman than the commanding officer.
Yeah. Krantz shows Sinclair and Garibaldi to a mysterious individual who just showed up out of nowhere. They were in a meeting, and flash, and this guy's in the meeting with them. This person's name is Zathras, and he has a sort of broken English way of speaking. He is not human. He has a bit of a clicking, tittering bit to his speech, and he sees Sinclair and appears to recognize him, but then decides, no, he is not the one. And since he's not the one, Zathras doesn't have to say anything. But they eventually convince him to give a little bit of information of what's going on. Someone needs Babylon 4. Someone needs the resources of the station for some sort of conflict that apparently is happening in the future. And the station is being pulled into the future for that purpose. Zathras states he's from the year 4000, I want to say 993, but we don't know if that's the same calendar, if it's, actually 2000 years in the future or, some other calendar. We just don't know because we don't know where that year count comes from. In any case, they continue evacuations. The station continues to have a lot of problems. It's not only people encountering, time flashes, but the structure of the station is also suffering from this temporal instability. At one point, they do see the one, who is a blue uniformed astronaut type figure who is floating in some sort of stasis field in and out of phase, basically. And Zathras goes up to this figure, calling him the One, hands him something, and we don't see what it is. Sinclair wants to know what this is all about, so he goes up to the One, touches his hand, and is immediately repelled across the room to collide into the very distant wall. So the contact between Sinclair and this disguised individual is something rather, abrupt. Anyways, what else? They continue to evacuate, and Garibaldi has his own flash, where he flashes back in time to just before he came on the station, and he has an argument with Lise Hampton, whom we met last episode and heard about in the episode before. We learned that this woman was his great love, whom he had a falling out with over the assignment to Babylon 5, and that falling out was the last time he had seen her. But his love for her was still strong, and during all the stuff through Voice in the Wilderness, he was worried about her fate. We saw that she was fine at the end of that episode, and we see her briefly with Garibaldi here. So he flashes back to the present day and is like, we've got to get the hell out of here because this is too much. I'm trying to remember any other significant developments along the way, but I think basically they get everybody off of the station, and then the station is about to flash through time. Oh, we find out that the One was responsible for holding the station in this time so that everybody could get evacuated. In other words, it was pulled out of time 4 years ago on its journey to the future, and it got basically parking braked along the way so that everybody could get off and the station could continue on. After everyone is off the station, we see the One take off his helmet, and it is an aged, grizzled Sinclair who bemoans the fact that he tried to warn them, but everything happened exactly as he remembered it happening, which we're going to come back to. I have questions. A woman who is just off screen lays a comforting hand on his shoulder and says that she understands. Her voice sounds like Delenn, and they leave the scene together. The station continues its journey through time, and all of our people go back to Babylon 5. So all of the Babylon 4 people who survived were rescued. Zathras at one point was pinned by a pillar, but he was fine. They got him off. It's okay. Let's see. No, they didn't get him off. The One rescued him. The One rescued him, right?
Right. He refused help from the Sinclair we know, but it was, when the scarred and older grizzled Sinclair showed up as the One, he's like, oh yeah, I knew you wouldn't leave me behind. So,
right.
Yeah, he was rescued, but the
Not
Babylon 5 crew that
evacuation.
we know of at the end of the episode do not know that.
Right. Okay, so that's the main plot. On the side of all of that, and not intersecting with it in any way that I noticed, Delenn leaves the station solo. She has a very important meeting to keep, and she goes to meet with the Minbari Grey Council, the secret hooded council of what we've been led to understand as like the secret leadership of the Minbari people that no one ever talks about. And it's possible that exactly the nature of the Great Council and its, everything is maybe not as secret as, I don't know. Kind of confused about them, but that's okay. How are they leading the people if they don't know who they are? Doesn't matter. There are 9 members of the Great Council. Delenn is one of them, but she has not been present for all of the secret hooded meetings because she's been on Babylon 5 because of the prophecy. We don't know what prophecy, but there's a prophecy. And they're basically like, yeah, so you're good. You did that. Good job. We want you back now because Dukat died 10 years ago, or the Dukat died. It's not a name, it's a title, apparently. And we need a new leader. So we want that to be you, Delenn. You have all the expertise outside of our world. You've seen all these alien races. You know the most about what is going to be affecting our people in the future. So come lead our people. She's like, oh, huh. She knows that once she is ensconced as leader of the Great Council and leader of the Minbari people, she will not be able to have any freedom to continue her work on Babylon 5. So she's very reluctant to take this post. She has a one-on-one conversation with one of the other Minbari Great Council members, and he basically tells her to follow her heart. So she calls together a meeting of the Great Council, which is very irregular because I guess, I don't know, it's not the right Tuesday. And she tells them that she cannot follow their ruling or their decision. So the Great Council actually is not immediately willing to accept that. They take a vote. And on a 5-4 vote, they do agree to release her from her calling as leader, let her go back to Babylon 5. But the consequence of this is that she will never be allowed back into the Great Council meetings. She is evidently off the Great Council. So she goes back to the station and back to whatever future plot lines we have with her. Did I miss any elements from the episode of note?
One thing I will mention is that they don't explicitly state that Babylon 5 is being pulled to the future. We know it has
Babylon
come
4.
4 years, or Babylon 4, yeah. We know it was pulled 4 years in the past. We don't know where it's going after that.
Right.
And I say that because there will be a time when they're following up on that, but depending on which cast and crew stayed and what was happening with various contingencies, JMS had to plan it so it would work either way.
Interesting.
So even when they were producing this, this was the 18th episode of production order, they did not know that. It is also worth noting that if production realities hadn't gotten in the way, this would have been the episode that aired before the Voice of the Wilderness two-parter, and Legacies would have been after that two-parter, which means this would have been our first exposure to Lise Hampton. So we would have had this scene prior to Garibaldi's reaction in the last two.
Okay. It works either way, I think, dramatically. The storytelling works, but that would have been a different feel because we would have seen that, and we would have, you know what, actually, I think I would have preferred that because that was one of my things I think I mentioned 2 weeks ago, hearing about Garibaldi's great love did not have as much impact on me as I think the show wanted it to. And having seen that would have, I think, made that more real. But that's okay. Stuff is what it is.
Yeah, and the other thing that would have worked a little bit better had they done it in that order, in Legacies, there was a flashback where the Minbari they had some triangular device that they were using to subdue guards so that they could steal Ducat's body. That's the triangular device that Delenn was given at the end of this episode.
Okay, she called it a triluminator.
Triluminary, yeah.
And the fact that the Great Council secretly has triangle tattoos on their foreheads that don't always show up. I don't know if that's like conceptually connected to that, but
if I understand it correctly, I think both designs would be making reference to the same source. So that the tattoo is not modeled on the triluminary or vice versa, but they are both modeled on the same source concept or idea, which we have not fully seen yet.
Okay. All right. Well, let's talk about who is in this episode. We have our guest stars. So playing Major Krantz is Kent Broadhurst. And I looked at his IMDb, and I don't know that I've ever seen him in anything. He's known for Leon the Professional and Silver Bullet and The Verdict. But I don't know any of these movies. I didn't know any of his credits. Do you know him from anywhere?
Yeah, I would think that that Leon the Professional, where he plays first policeman, is probably the best known of that he's in. I didn't recognize him, but I would have seen him probably in his guest shot as Colonel Stanley South on MathNet, because I did not miss that as a child. I don't know if you're...
MathNet.
Yes, it used to be a segment in Square One, and then it spun out on its own, and it was a Dragnet parody where they solve every crime with math. It was
I
great.
loved MathNet. It was the bomb. Yes. Okay.
Yeah, so he was in a MathNet. He was also in a Walker Texas Ranger, which JMS really helped set up and get going. But yeah, looking at it, he's appeared 4 times on Law and Order as what appears to be 4 different characters, as well as Special Victims Unit. So
Right.
yeah, he's got 33 credits. Most recently, a 2011 episode of Person of Interest, which I haven't seen, but I've heard it described as Hobo Batman.
Then we have Tim Choate as Zathras, who he was in Pearl Harbor as a Navy doctor. So I probably saw him there because I saw Pearl Harbor, but I saw it when it was newish, and I haven't seen it since. He's best known for that and for this and for 2 other things I have not seen. So I am not familiar with him either.
Yeah, the actor will be back he actually not necessarily as Zathras, but between Babylon 5 and Crusade. This is the first of 5 times that he'll be in the show. But yeah, he's one looking at it. I mean, he was in 2 episodes of Murder, She Wrote, and we have watched both because my wife and I are going through that. We're in season 8, and he appeared in season 5 and a season 8 episode that we have seen already. But I don't think it stands out, and partly because the amount of makeup he's in, it alters things a bit. He was also in Jake and the Fat Man, I see. I don't know if it was one of the episodes JMS wrote or not. No, it wasn't. It was a season 1 episode, and JMS didn't pick up until one of the later seasons. But I don't know how easily he would be recognizable, because I think I've seen clips of him in other things. And on top of having that thick makeup, that makeup made it harder to speak. So he ended up kind of doing a voice to help make it consistent. So it makes him very difficult to recognize under that makeup.
And our third guest star is, of course, I'm reading her name, Denise Gentile as Lisa Hampton. We've seen her before, and we'll see. Well, yes. So yeah, those are our guest stars. Not any big faces that I'm familiar with at this point. So what are some things that you saw in the episode?
Actually, one other guest star I'm going to mention, Mark Hendrickson. He doesn't have a huge role in this, but he actually shows up a lot in Babylon 5 as a variety of different aliens. So he's been Drazi, he's been Narn. He's in 18 episodes of Babylon 5 and 2 episodes of Crusade.
I imagine he was probably the Grey Council member who spoke one-on-one with Delenn, but I didn't see that that character was named. So I did look at him to see if that character might come back, but I could not tell if he did or not.
Yeah, he's Grey Council 2. We previously saw him as Grey Council 1 in And the Sky Full of Stars.
So maybe he was supposed to be the same person in that. Okay.
Yeah.
Because the number 1, number 2, for those who might not be aware, is just usually their order of speech in the script. Not that the number 2 in this episode must always be number 2.
Yeah. So yeah, we have seen him before. It is intended to be the same character, and this is the 7th time we've seen him. He was a Narn captain in Midnight on the Firing Line. He was Durog in Parliament of Dreams, Thagras in the War Prayer, Grey Council number 1 in The Sky Full of Stars, Ashok in Deathwalker, Alien number 1 in Survivors, and now here he is in Grey Council 2. So they're happy with his work. Not everyone can work under heavy makeup, but apparently he's one of them. So they bring him in a lot. So he's only got 4 acting credits, but that's Babylon 5 and Crusade as 2 of them. And Doug McCoy has 1 credit as Cooch Elliott from the movie Sudden Death, and his only other IMDb credit is to be in 4 episodes of Babylon 5. So he was Delta 7 in Midnight on the Firing Line and Fighter number 2 in Signs of Importance. He was Alpha 7 here, and we will see him again as a guard in season 3.
Gotcha. So I guess we can start with that opening scene, which I found delightful and charming. There were 2 moments in the episode where I feel like JMS is like, okay, you know what, let's just take a second and put some humanity into this thing, because we've got a lot of signs and portents going on. And the opening scene was one of them. There's another scene where Sinclair and Garibaldi are flying, I think when they're flying toward Babylon 4. And Garibaldi's like, Commander, I got to ask you, when you're getting dressed in the morning, do you fasten your pants and then zip them, or do you zip them up and then fasten them? And Sinclair is completely taken aback by this out of nowhere question, and at first kind of puts Garibaldi off because it's like, what are you talking about? Why are you bringing that up? We've got stuff going on. And Garibaldi reminds everything is a life and death conversation. So it's just kind of a moment of friendship with them because then Sinclair, they start talking. And Sinclair refuses to answer questions about his socks, though. So that is just way over the line when it comes to Sinclair's personal life.
Yeah,
No
so
socks.
Yeah, the zip, fasten, zip conversation is not just a nice piece of humanity. Ever since then, JMS and every male cast member, even the guy who plays Mr. Morden, is asked at conventions, which they do, to the point that people are taking sides and walking around with buttons at conventions.
Okay, well, I guess if that's what's really going on here, then Blaine, time to fess up. Are you fasten zip or zip fasten?
Honestly, it depends on whether the fasten part is a button or one of those little hooks. I will zip and then fasten if it's a button, and fasten then zip if it's one of those hooks.
Interesting. Okay. Well, I'm pretty much always a fasten zip kind of person, but you can be wrong. It's okay.
Yeah. Okay, and on Ivanova's conversation, as you guys know, I've got the script books, and the scripts have little preambles, so I don't like revealing too much because JMS did intend this as a thank you for the fans. He figured it'd be the devoted fans buying them. I am going to read one paragraph because it sets up this quite a bit. I mean, we first saw this element of Ivanova's attitude towards mornings teased in Signs and Portents. And so here's the one paragraph that he wrote about it. I hate mornings. I hate them with a passion that I cannot possibly convey to you. I'm a night person. When I'm not on a show, I generally write from 9 p.m. until about 4 or 5 a.m. or until 3 or 4 a.m. when I am working on a show. Everyone knows not to schedule me for single-digit morning meetings. After 10 a.m., I can usually handle myself when sufficiently caffeinated, but not before then. It's not a sight anybody wants to see. Harlan Ellison, who marched through angry Memphis avenues with Martin Luther King, joined a street gang in Red Hook, and walked fearlessly into the penal homes in New York, once said that there is only one thing in the world that frightens him, seeing me before 10 in the morning pre-coffee.
Well, good. I like that he's inserted that into Ivanova. And of course, we have discussions of coffee going all the way back to the pilot, where
Takashima.
Takashima. Yeah, Takashima would be her Japanese pronunciation. They called her Takashima. Yeah, where she made it a point that she had the coffee pods that were illegal. So, yes. And then Ivanova inherited the coffee pods because Ivanova needs her coffee. I'd like to think that maybe Takashima and Ivanova were like friends at some point in the service together. And she's like, oh, can I have those? And Takashima was like, yeah, because I'll be able to get coffee where I'm going. So here you go. That's what I'd like to think.
Yeah, that works for me. Or even if they didn't know each other, as one XO to another saying, there's going to be early morning wake-up calls, you're going to need this.
So I want to draw two comparisons between the Babylon series of stations and other things. So when they described the history of Babylon stations and how one of them disappeared, it immediately made me think of Torchwood. Torchwood was the spinoff of Doctor Who in the mid-2000s, starring John Barrowman as Captain Jack Harkness. It was sort of, it's hard to describe. I feel like there's a bit of an X-Files feel to the concept, but not to the tone. And the Torchwood base that they're in that show is like the fourth or fifth Torchwood. And he goes to a very similar recitation of what, the other Torchwoods. Torchwood 1 had been destroyed in the Doctor Who episode, The Army of Ghosts and Doomsday. And another, along the way, he mentions that one of the Torchwoods, I think it was the previous one, disappeared one day and they still haven't found it. So just whenever I heard this Babylon 5 series of description of Babylon stations, I immediately thought of that. Are you familiar with Torchwood? Did you watch that?
I have seen some of it. I admit I've been lacking on the Doctor Who spin-offs. So I own it all. I haven't gotten through it all, which is funny considering I have seen every surviving episode of Doctor Who going back to An Unearthly Child and most of the animated recreations.
Mm-hmm.
But Torchwood, Class, and Sarah Jane Adventures. I haven't started Class. Sarah Jane Adventures, I'm one season in, and Torchwood, I was partway through season 1.
Okay. Yeah, I've seen the first 2 seasons of Torchwood, the first season of Sarah Jane, and I never checked out Class. Kept meaning to, but never did. Will eventually, at some point. The other thing it reminded me of is how they explicitly never did a similar recitation of the deep space stations on Star Trek. And I think there was some disagreement on exactly why it was called Deep Space Nine in the among the creatives, because in one of the novels they say that it's not 9 because it's 9th in the sequence of stations, but they make this other kind of gobbledygook reason of why it's 9. And we've heard other deep space stations referenced on Star Trek. Possibly the most famous example is Deep Space Station K7 from the Trouble with Triples episode. So is there a series of deep space labeled stations in Star Trek, of which this is the 9th? Possibly, but they've never made it explicit. So for whatever reason, Deep Space 9, they don't really talk about Deep Space 1 through 8. It doesn't matter to the story, and they've never brought it up.
Yeah, and I think there was even an original series episode that had Deep Space 4, and I believe the contention in the writers' room then was, if we've already had deep space stations over 70 years ago, why are we only getting to number 9 right now? Especially since it used to be a Cardassian station, which is now managed by Bajor. So that's one of the cases where it's called Deep Space Nine because the creators liked the sound of it.
Mm-hmm.
And they never really did seem to come up with a reasonable in-story explanation. But the characters who live in that world never seem to question it. So whatever the explanation is, makes perfect sense to them.
Right. And since, Babylon 5 being Babylon 5 is obviously, with this episode, important to the actual concept of the story, bring that up here, whereas never bring it up on Star Trek, both of those paths and choices make perfect sense for the stories that they're telling. But it's something I thought of. I think I've made passing reference to it before, but since we were here. Now, I knew that this concept was coming at some point early in the Babylon 5 watchings, the idea that Babylon 4 was going to show up again. That just was something I came across. I had the general impression it was going to happen later in the series. But, obviously I was wrong. Here it is. Other things we have going on here. I don't know if I really feel like I've gotten to know Major Krantz as a person. He just seems to be kind of a high-strung, this is a crisis situation, and I'm just, on the edge of my seat dealing with it person, officer, and maybe we'll get to know him as a person later. Maybe he shows up again. I don't know. But as a character, he just seems to be more of like a making things happen for the station person. Which I guess is just kind of to contrast that with the fact that we know the Babylon 5 people so well.
Yeah, there's some of that. I think a lot of it, if we remember, he's not a commanding officer. He is like the construction foreman. So it would be like, you're running the construction of a new wing of a hospital, and then all of a sudden you have to deal with a patient in cardiac arrest. This is not what he was trained to work with.
Gotcha.
Plus, he just found out that he lost 4 years of his life.
Yes.
So, yeah, he was definitely out of sorts, but I think very understandably so when you remember what his actual role is.
So, I think we're 2 years into the calendar of Babylon 5. I think we mentioned at some point earlier in Station 1 that in the notes somewhere or in the script of the episode itself, it said that it's been 2 years since the station opened up. So that means that the station disappeared 2 years before Babylon 5 opened. Do you recall, is that consistent with previous descriptions, or did they say 4 years ago last time?
I don't remember them pinning a date on it at all. Okay. I just remember them, what they would say is it disappeared just after it went online. It's somewhere in the 24 to 48 hour range. for how long it was around before it disappeared.
Okay.
But that's it. Yeah.
So it went online as in they turned on the power, but it did not go online as in the operational staff and officers were present and running it.
That's correct, yeah.
Okay.
So the 1,300 people they were evacuating were mostly construction people.
Right. They did actually have a conversation about the logistics of the evacuation, like how many people they could haul from Sector 14 back to whatever Sector Babylon 5 is in, Sector 7 maybe, in one go. And so you got to hear kind of like what the resources of an evacuation would be. So in future episodes, we could look back at these numbers. If we ever have to talk about the logistics of evacuating Babylon 5, we know now how many people can go in a trip. Sinclair and Garibaldi are seen fighting a battle. I'm guessing that's the future because, well, no, they knew each other from before. That's why Garibaldi was chosen by Sinclair to come on the station. So it could be the past. I don't know.
Yeah, that one, it struck me as being from the future as well, because Sinclair in that case didn't seem to know what was going on, whereas with Garibaldi, the dialogue let us know immediately, oh, this is something that's already happened.
Right.
Whereas the one that we had with Garibaldi, and actually Garibaldi's conversation, Lee says, you've met the man twice and you're going to Babylon 5 with him. So we're talking about guys who became fast friends. And when they talk about how they met, this scene wasn't described.
Right.
So it doesn't seem to fit in the existing backstory. So it does feel like it would be something in the future, which could also be why Sinclair was so adamant about trying to ask questions before getting swept away to figure, yeah, what's going on? How are we going to stop this kind of thing?
I am curious how some of these elements are going to be addressed or explained or handled or whatever, knowing that there are more cast changes coming up after season 1. I'm just curious because we'll have to address that when we get to our season 2 episode 1 discussion about who's gone and why. And we've, I think, mentioned it on the episode before. I don't know if those got edited out or not, but
they did get edited out. Yes.
Okay, so more cast changes coming, but we're not going to say who because we like to leave things as spoiler light or free as possible.
Mm-hmm. I don't think we'll say when either, so I might edit that piece of this conversation too.
No! Speaking of spoiling things unintentionally, when I mentioned Elise Hampton coming back, you said, well, I don't know if it might be in flashbacks or not. And I'm like, I didn't know there were going to be flashbacks. So now I know. And here we have flashbacks. So, when you try to obliquely cover up something, sometimes you just highlight it. Not you particularly, but like the human, experience in general.
Yeah, and some of it is just trying to keep options open so people do not feel that they're confident about what it's going to be.
Right. I don't know. I'm trying to think of other standout moments. Like, when Sinclair touches the one. It is, I think, a common enough trope in science fiction time travel stories. Not a consistent trope, because there are definitely other stories that ignore this completely. But contact with yourself from another point in your timeline creates a paradox, because you're not supposed to exist in both places at once. Now, from a purely physical view, I feel like if we can accept that the person has traveled through time, then we can accept that they can interact with their past self. But from a metaphysical point of view, I can see how that might be a thing, because you have two. Because, like, the universe doesn't care if your molecules are in your human body or in the air around you. So why is just, interacting with your previous self a thing? But
yeah,
if these are two instances of a person.
Yeah, that's something that is showing up in science fiction, but I haven't seen it come up in science.
Right.
It can make for interesting story obstacles. I honestly am having a hard time remembering an example that predates Back to the Future Part 2, where that was part of the whole comedy of errors, is not bumping into himself, which seemed mostly to exist to not mess up the history that they created in Back to the Future 1.
Right. Yes.
So, yeah, you couldn't knowingly break that story.
And I like that because, if I didn't see myself yesterday, then tomorrow me should not be able to go back and see me yesterday, if we were talking about like a holistic view of time travel all along one consistent timeline, there are alternative versions of Can You Meet Yourself, like in The Time Traveler's Wife, where Henry de Tamble, the unwilling, chronically displaced individual, actually explores the option of intimate encounters with himself whenever he runs into other versions of himself. So, there's that whole thing. But it does foreshadow very, very loudly who is inside the suit whenever Sinclair touches him and gets blasted back.
I suppose there is that. I don't remember it being that it's a Sinclair thing. There's no clear evidence that it couldn't have been Garibaldi, or that Garibaldi would not have had the same reaction because they were time displaced, or that maybe Zathras was the only one able to have contact with him because he was part of the time traveling group. So it could have been something like that barrier that the Star Furies got through as they were going, that distortion field. They will pick up on this in a later episode. I'd have to pay attention to the details there to see if they explain it as.
Okay. The only thing I would have to say about that is that they were able to have contact with Zathras with no problem.
Yeah, but Zathras also had the time stabilizer at that time, which he gave to the one in that scene. And
so you think maybe if the one had the time stabilizer and was not like floating out of phase a la the Tholian web, that Sinclair and he might have been able to have contact?
Yeah.
Okay.
And if you're wondering, the design of the spacesuit was not an intentional nod to 2001: A Space Odyssey. Because of the tight budgets, they decided to try and rent a suit if it existed rather than create one. And the only one available for rent had been created for 2010 Odyssey 2, the year we make contact. Odyssey 2 is the book title. The year we make contact is the movie title. So yes, that's why they're so similar, because it was actually a 2010 prop.
Nice. Okay, good. The mystery astronaut reminded me very much of, a lot of this episode reminded me of stuff from other episodes, but the mystery astronaut reminded me very much of the Matt Smith Doctor Who arc of the astronaut who kills the Doctor and who is inside that mask the whole time.
Yes.
But
the Impossible Astronaut, season 6 premiere of the reboot.
Yeah, that starts a plot line through that season. What else? Yeah, so I guess whenever the one takes off his helmet and it turns out to be Sinclair, I wouldn't say that I was surprised.
Yeah, once you start taking off the helmet, you know it's someone that you're going to recognize, and because they're in charge, you kind of default to the commanding officer.
Right.
So even if they hadn't shaken hands, as soon as you're going to get revealed to who the one is, it's like, okay, it's probably either going to be Sinclair or a complete stranger.
It's interesting that, they seem to want to hide the identity of his associate at the end, but yet she has spoken lines. So it's pretty easy to guess who it is, although obviously the guess could be wrong. But it sounds like Delenn, which means that Delenn and Sinclair in the future are doing something here. That's another reason that made me think that Babylon 4 is being pulled into the future, is that old Sinclair is here doing that. And pulling it into the future means that stopping along the way, at this point 4 years later, it just means that you're stopping along the way. You're not changing direction through the time stream. So I realized that JMS might have been faced with a situation where he could potentially have to roll that back and make it a backwards time trip. But I feel like the natural read of this episode is they're going to the future.
Yeah, no comment.
At least it was my natural read.
Yeah, like I said, it is definitely open to that interpretation as well as others. But yeah, I can see the tendency to say, well, this is the direction they were already going. So
I guess we should talk about Delenn. So her background and her nature and her role as somebody else's secret has been on the side of things throughout all of this season. It has very rarely come to the fore of a plot line. It's just like we're finding stuff out about Delenn along the way. And the fact that all of those associations are apparently dissolved, it just feels kind of weird for her character, because she is now bereft of secret associations that no one knew she had to begin with, so it no longer matters. Now, I'm sure that there's more to it than that, and that it will matter, but it's kind of, at this point, it's like, oh, she went from being a apparent nobody with secret somebody associations to an actual nobody.
This is one that, yeah, I'm sorry, I meant to follow up on that when you were talking about it earlier. The membership of the Grey Council is secret to other races. The existence of the Grey Council and its membership is public knowledge within the Minbari.
Oh, but since the Minbari are such a closed culture, no one else knows.
So the humans have kind of heard that they're led by the Grey Council, but they didn't know who was on it. Whereas the Minbari know, just like Lanier knew that she was Satai Delenn when he first arrived on the station.
Right.
So
Jakar made a lot of menacing descriptions of the Grey Council, which I feel like I remember you saying something about that. Some of that was going to get rolled back over the time, but maybe I'm misremembering.
No, I did say actually that conversation was from The Gathering, and that entire conversation had very little that was true, but the characters who were speaking believed at least some of what they were saying at the time they were saying it. So some of it was deception, some of it was just genuine errors.
We've never known Jakar to speak with hyperbole or manipulation, so just kidding. Speaking of Jakar, a lot of our ambassadors are absent. Oh, speaking of absent people, yeah, there's a whole conversation about a medical crisis and a medical condition and a medical situation with a character that does not have Dr. Franklin talking to us because evidently his episode count for the contract for this season had already been planned out.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much what happened. That it's just, okay, Franklin needs to do things, but the actor's contract doesn't allow him to be in the episode, so then other people are just saying, yeah, this is what happened. And honestly, it works if I think if the first time through, when I wasn't looking at this in terms of doing it for a podcast and knowing that there was a restriction on how many times the characters appeared in a season, I don't know that his on-screen absence would have really stood out to me.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, if this was a Trek show where the people in the credits are guaranteed a higher number of appearances, often every episode, then yeah, I'm sure they would have, he would have been called in one day for a 30-second, he might have been on the vid screen saying, okay, Commander, this is what I found, or, quick scene in sick bay.
Right.
But it's interesting that even when the actors weren't called in, this was a very different set from most shows and most workplaces. Most people, on your day off, you do not go to work. Here, they were filming in what used to be a Spawn jacuzzi factory that was way off the beaten path. And the people who were not filming in that episode would show up because they were in the area. JMS describes, he's like, there's no area to be in. They were just coming. And it's one of the proudest achievements. He has no idea how they pulled it off and doesn't know how they could do it again. But the people used to just like to come hang out. So
that's pretty neat, though. That speaks well of the environment of the behind the scenes situation on the show, which often you find out that a beloved show has a very hostile or negative behind the scenes environment. So it's nice when you find out the opposite.
Yeah. As they say, that the tone on the set is usually set by the name on the top of the call sheet. So here, Michael O'Hare kind of took the lead. For comparison, I heard a Star Trek panel with Armin Shimmerman and Ethan Phillips, and oddly, the Deep Space Nine set was pleasant but extremely professional, whereas the Voyager set wasn't always pleasant, but it was a little more loose and a little more friendly. And the way they put that is that top of the call sheet on Deep Space Nine was Mr. Brooks, whereas on Voyager, it was Katie.
Gotcha. I can see that. See that.
Yeah, so it was, the Deep Space Nine was always professional, but also in the sense of always being professional. Like, the people got along, they stuck to the work, and they got the job done with minimal interpersonal conflict and even a marriage. While Voyager, it was a little more relaxed, but there were some conflicts.
Who got married during the production of Deep Space Nine?
Alexander Siddig, who played Dr. Bashir, and Nana Visitor, who played Kiri Nerys, which is why in a later episode they wrote in that Keiko's baby was implanted in Kira to save it after a shuttle accident because Nana Visitor was pregnant with Alexander Siddig's child.
Oh, I thought Nana Visitor was gay. Okay.
Her mirror universe counterpart appears to be pansexual, or of Kira Nerys anyway. But no, Nana Visitor.
Married woman. Gotcha.
Yep. Multiple
Alrighty.
times, because she and Siddig, that marriage didn't last much beyond the show.
I see. It's funny how much she loathes Bashir in the early seasons of that show. We are, of course, at the point in airing where the second season of Deep Space Nine has ended and the third has not yet started, because we are in the summertime. And for a lot of shows, that means we're between seasons. But Babylon 5 is not following traditional airing schedules.
No, thanks to P10, which honestly, I think I like the idea of the small network. I think wrapping up the season in July and August was a good idea. I just think that Chrysalis season finale should have been part of the August run.
Right.
But more on that in October.
Right. Okay. I'm running out of session for the league. Do you have anything else about the episode before we go into the next segment?
No, I think you have hit on a lot of the key points here.
All right.
So, last best hope, your standout character or character moment.
That's my job.
Oh, yes. Sorry.
So, moving on to the last best hope. This is the part of the show where we talk about the character or character moment that stands out from the episode. And Blaine, what is your takeaway from this episode?
I do like Zathras. He's got a very distinct pattern, which apparently was modeled on Straczynski's grandmother in her limited English. That's those short, abrupt sentences.
Uh-huh.
So when he said, great war, terrible war, many die, or, that sort of thing was modeled on grandmother. So he was an interesting guest star in the case where not just the appearance, but that speech pattern makes him feel alien start to finish.
Right.
So it doesn't feel like a human with a bumpy forehead.
And when you're in a universe where we don't have universal translators, having somebody having to learn English and therefore having a halting, stilted way of speaking is not uncommon. And dissociating that presentation with any actual human ethnic groups that might be insultingly portrayed historically as having bad English, I think is also a good thing. So yeah, I liked Zathras too. So he as a whole, or is there a particular moment with him?
Yeah, mostly him as a whole.
I've actually been having a hard time with this for this episode, because while I like the episode and I like the concept, there weren't a whole lot of individual moments that jumped out at me. Like the moments of humanity and humor at the beginning and then on the shuttle were nice. The reveal of the one as Sinclair felt portentous. Speaking of portentous, they actually worked the line signs and portents into the episode, which is always kind of nice. It's like whatever Dark Shadows actually mentions, the dark shadows around Collinwood Estate. But I had a hard time thinking of like an actual element of the episode that stood out above the rest. So since we have to have something, I'm going to choose where Sinclair and Garibaldi. Sinclair is at first rebuffed by Garibaldi's random question, and then Garibaldi kind of like, goes off and just decides to be his own self because he feels kind of, maybe a little bit hurt feelings, maybe a lot hurt feelings, but he kind of, plays it nicely. But then Sinclair reminds himself this is his friend, loosens up, and actually responds to the fasten zip question, because that's a very real human dynamic. That is a real thing that happens where, like, you're with your friend, they do something that puts you off, and you respond a bit more harshly than you should. And then you realize, okay, I need to loosen up and like be a friend here, because I'm too uptight right now, and that's not a good thing. I found that relatable. So that's what I will choose as my last best hope. That takes us to our Giving Form to the Dream segment. Now, for those of you new to the show, this is not a spoiler session. This is where we try to stick pins in concepts that will come back later. Now, what I like to do is I like to figure out whatever, mention whatever I've figured out that probably feels like it's going to come back later. And then there's usually stuff that I have missed because Blaine knows the series much better than I do. So all three of our guest stars, their characters are, this is not their only appearance. So I know we're going to see more of them, which we talked about with Lise Hampton last time. And I don't know when or how or why or what. Could be flashbacks, could be flash forwards, could be, I don't know, their picture on a mantle. But each of our guest actors will come back as these roles. And I would imagine that the whole Babylon 4 concept is not going away. And the future great war that's going to destroy everything or risk destroying everything that Zathras is all concerned about, that's probably going to get followed up on at some point. But yeah, that's all I've got for this.
Okay, so yeah, it's broadly speaking, we have the two plot lines and they will both continue. So like you said, the A plot, there will come a time at some point between here and the series finale when we know exactly why this future Sinclair is stealing Babylon 5, or Babylon 4, which war he's stealing Babylon 4 to fight, and exactly when that war takes place, who's on each side. So we will get all the answers. Not going to say when. The executives at Warner Brothers asked when that was going to be because, when the script came in, they assumed that we'd get the answers probably by the end of the season. And they asked, so when exactly are we going to get this? And JMS answered, and then decided to pretend they didn't hear that answer. Yeah, so that everything about the time travel, those questions will be answered. And Delen's ejection from the Grey Council is also something that's going to have consequences.
Okay. Yeah, like I said, the feeling that she has lost all of the stuff that was secret about her to begin with, and therefore she no longer has anything secret that's not a permanent end to that bit of idea. Yeah, it's just kind of an interesting way to where we are right now with it all.
Yeah, there is one other element, and it's actually a very subtle little piece of Delen's story.
Okay.
We've seen Delen putting things together and building something in her quarters since Signs and Portents. We don't know what it is, but she's put a couple things. She's had something in the corner that's been getting bigger. It's been quite subtle, but the components that it's being made out of look like the same components that her shuttlecraft controls were made of.
Okay.
To the point that these are the same props. These episodes are filmed out of order, and they took pieces that were in the larger finished structure that we haven't seen yet and put them on this. So we know she's building something. We don't know what, we don't know why, but we've now seen it seems to be a piece of technology. So it's not just a piece of art or sculpture.
Interesting. Okay. So that brings us to the end of our episode. Let's talk about the immediate future of the show. As a reminder, next week we will be talking about the quality of mercy. And then the show will be going on Babylon 5 went on a hiatus until October. And then the season finale aired as a walk into the season 2 premiere. So we'll be coming back to the series then. Whenever the show goes on hiatus, we go into a less regular production schedule. We don't like to leave those hiatuses completely void. We will be having some special episodes coming out. Assuming that y'all are writing in your feedback, we will be having a feedback special. We will also be doing the first in our series of What Else Has JMS Done episodes. We're talking about the 9 episodes of He-Man and the Masters of the Universe that he wrote. So do be looking forward to those over the course of the end of summer and early fall. But speaking of feedback, if you want to write your comments, questions, concerns, secret recipes, Blaine, where can they do that?
The best place is probably to send us an email to Babylon5 30 years later at gmail.com, where you can use numerals or spell out the numbers. We've captured all 4 variants on that email address.
You can also leave comments on our podcast websites, the first of which is mine, johnreadscomics.com, where there is no H. And I'm sure there are some H's there, but, not immediately. Anyways, go to there and you'll see all of the podcasts, or the vast majority of the podcasts I have produced over the years are linked, and you'll be seeing these episodes coming up at the top of the list. So you can leave comments on your thoughts on the show, your thoughts on our thoughts on the show, and anything else you want to say.
Now, you can also leave comments at bureau42.com, which is where all of my podcasts are hosted, along with other things. It's a general science fiction and fantasy news site.
And you can also leave a review on the podcatcher of your choice. We do check Apple Podcasts for reviews. If your podcatcher also allows reviews and you say things about us, whether nice or not so nice, but hopefully nice, and you would like us to read and acknowledge that review on the air, please drop us a note to that effect using one of the other means of communication. As I said, though, if you leave it through Apple Podcasts, we will catch that and read it on the air.
Right. And the last place that you can comment is on the YouTube channel. So we do have a YouTube channel. The first few episodes, I was manually creating the visualizers and everything, and I have since discovered, it may or may not have been an upgrade in between, or it may have been something I just missed, that our podcast host platform can auto-post to YouTube. So we know every episode will definitely make it to YouTube. I will just be manually curating the playlists. So you can say, yeah, I want to skip the feedback episodes, or I want to skip those other things that JMS worked on, even though Jon and Blaine have worked very, very hard on getting those podcast episodes out, often watching a lot more of the various shows than they normally do. You just wanted the Babylon 5 stuff, or you want to skip the ancillary material, because we do have access to the Babylon 5 comics, so those will be in these episodes, because we don't want to have more than a 3-week gap if it's humanly possible to avoid it. We're still trying to track down every novel, but we'd ideally like to cover those too, even though some of them are not considered canon.
But all of that stuff, stories and what happens there.
Yeah. So all of that stuff, we do have multiple curated YouTube playlists. So you're able to say, oh, I picked it up on DVD. I just binge watched all of season 1. Well, you can go to YouTube and binge listen to just our season 1 coverage. So that if you're going by playlist, it will stop before you hit season 2.
All right. So do be back next time for the Quality of Mercy. So until next time, everybody, thank you very much for listening.
And good eating to you.